Hi everyone, this is Dave from Cosmia Festival, and welcome to the first episode of the End of the World Reading Club Extra Book Reviews. So we review about 12 to 13 books a year as part of the End of the World Reading Club, and that is not enough time for me to talk about all the books that I want to talk about. So we're starting a kind of shorter series where I give you a pitch on books that I think you should buy, and I've got about 10 minutes to do it on a video. So for our first episode, I've picked The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. Now before we even get into this, spoiler warnings. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what happens in this book. I'm also going to be spoiling a bit of Fringe Season 5 and possibly a little bit of Sense8 if you are particularly spoiler averse. I will leave a list in the description of the things that I'm spoiling massively, so pause the video now if you're not sure, and then come back afterwards when you've watched all those amazing things because they're all so great. In particular, I'm going to talk about Fringe because as I was reading this book, I was also watching the last series of Fringe again on rewatch, and I thought there's some really interesting parallels between what happens in that story and in this one, which we'll get into in a minute. So this book was published in 2019 in the UK, and this lovely edition caught my eye on the bookshelves. I'd never heard of the author, but the colour was enough for me to pick it up, and then I read the back and thought, yeah, buying this in the bag, done. I'm saying this right off the bat, if you hate them, this is a time travel story. If you hate those, stop the video now, go watch something else in our content. The author, Annalee Newitz, is also a journalist, was a founding editor of IO9, so they know their tech stuff because they've spent years and years writing about it. And that really comes across in this story, I think. There's a real understanding of some of the implications and challenges associated with time travel storytelling. So what happens in this great story? Essentially, a small group of women are fighting to prevent a small group of men from going back in time to change history so that men's rights are total and forever fixed in society and women are screwed. It takes place on a version of Earth where time travel has always been possible and people can go back in time but not forward in time. So the future is unwritten, but different characters have got different presence, so we've got more knowledge of what happens after the action that features in the book. This is quite a clever conceit because I think it gets round some of the challenges to do with time travel storytelling. Cause and effect side of things is built into the story rather than being the thing that you worry about as you watch the characters do some other stuff. And right from the beginning, I love the setting and the tone. The first chapter takes place at a Riot Grrrl concert in the early 90s. As a fan of grunge and Riot Grrrl, I was immediately on board for the story. Even though I was not a teenage girl at the time, in the early 90s, it's a little bit early for my period. It still was really evocative of a scene which was both similar but also alien, and that was really intriguing. If you're not sure whether you're going to like this or not, I would highly recommend giving that first chapter a read because it will give you a proper sense of how this story is going to unfold and the way it's going to be told. Another thing that was incredibly pleasing for me was that a lot of the action in the story takes place in the past, and I'm a history graduate, so I was super on board for that. There's some characters in here who exist in real life, so you can go and do that reading and compare and contrast between this story and what actually happened, which I think is really great, and it's something you don't often get the chance to do in genre writing. And what I would say is that this story is massively of its time and its place. There's a palpable anger and rage and determination about combating the challenges that particularly American society is going through at the moment in the so-called culture wars. And like all the best genre writing, this story is talking about that stuff through the lens of science fiction. This allusion to the culture wars and a fight between men and women for who controls the narrative, who controls the facts, who controls the future, had some great parallels with me for Fringe Season 5. Basically in the last series of Fringe, men come from the future to colonise the present of the storytelling, take it over, and enforce their own rules and regulations and kind of stamp out any dissent. Now this story doesn't feature the same kind of slightly heavy-handed Nazi illusions. If it had been written a year later, it may have done, considering what's happened since then, but it does speak to the idea that a small group of men are trying to control, police the lives and experiences of everybody else. And one of the places that this all plays out in the story is this editing of the past. If I was going to pitch the story in a very odd way, I might say it's a bit like Wikipedia, the novel. Wikipedia has got an issue with edit wars, where people are going back and changing things, and there's a tussle back and forth, and that to me would seem to be a really strong inspiration for this story. And this idea that what if somebody could do that with actual reality rather than just a website? There's some other ways that this narrative device also reflects current society, at least in my mind. One of the consequences of characters going back in time and making changes is that people can disappear. They've never existed. A little bit Back to the Future-y there, I suppose, if you think about that fading photograph. And there's a moment where a character comes back into the present. They've just seen somebody that they know die, and they're not there anymore, and they have to try and persuade other women that this person did exist, and they believe her. Believe women. There was a thematic link there to gaslighting, of somebody knowing something's true and then society saying to them, you're wrong, it didn't exist, don't believe it. So again, really clever and a really nice consequence of the narrative structure that the book has set up. There's also something very pleasing to the kind of vibe and the outlook of the Netflix show Sense8, sadly cancelled. Sense8 is also about a ragtag bunch of diverse characters trying to save the world from a small evil conspiracy. And if you don't believe me, Chapter 9. The other thing that I think comes through is that connection with, and I'm sure this was in the author's mind because of all the centenary work that's happened over the last kind of 10 years or so, is the women's suffrage movement. The very first kind of quote on the back of the book is, "Do you remember when we had the vote?" And that taps into some of the narrative, particularly in American society, around elections, around disenfranchisement of people, is that the vote isn't something that you get once and then it's there forever. It's your rights, your right to vote, your right to do whatever you want, is something that you have to continually keep an eye on and struggle to prevent people taking away from you. It taps in also to reproductive rights and lots of other challenges, and it really all builds up to make this novel be very much of the moment. And that brings me to my conclusion. Some of the greatest science fiction writing has a very long shelf life because it's universal enough in its approach that it can be a touchstone for generations and generations to come. 1984 is a great example of this because everybody has been able to take something from the challenges of combating totalitarianism and fascism in its storytelling. And although I'm not quite sure that this novel will gain the same kind of status in society, I think throughout the years to come, if readers need something to channel that rage, to make them refocus their efforts to protect and advance the rights of a whole range of people, then this novel can serve a real social good and be a real inspiration for groups going forwards. If you're angry about the world, if you are concerned about the erosion of the outcomes of the Enlightenment, this might be the book for you to read, and I think you'll get a lot from it. It's also just a great story, great storytelling. I haven't even talked about the characters, about the settings, about the time travel mechanics. All of that I want to leave for you to discover. What I wanted to give you is an impression of the feelings and the relevance of this story to the world that we're living in right now, and to give you the impetus to go buy a copy and read it for yourself, and then come back, tell us what you think. If you like this video, click subscribe, click the bell icon, watch our other content, share it on social media. We look forward to seeing you again really soon, and stay safe.